You may not realize this, but you all have a superpower at your disposal. Today, we're going to be talking about how to unleash it and how best to put it to use. Hello and welcome to PowerSpeaking Live. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, the host of this monthly series and the CEO of PowerSpeaking Incorporated. The superpower I'm referring to are your strategic storytelling skills. Stories are powerful things. They stir emotion. They change minds, they spark action. Have you ever stopped to consider why it is that stories are so much more impactful than facts and figures alone? The answer is rooted in both evolution and brain science. Throughout history, worldwide, among all cultures, stories have been used to pass on traditions, life lessons, ensure survival. That being the case, we're hardwired to see the world and understand it through stories. More recently, a body of brain science has uncovered even more discoveries with regard to the remarkable power of stories. For instance, professors or brain scientists at the Princeton University have been able to study what happens in the brains of storytellers and listeners through MRI technology. And what they found is that when a person is telling a story, the storyteller's brain and listener's brain effectively sync up. It's a term known as neurocoupling. So in other words, by simply telling a story, you can implant emotions, sensations, and ideas into another person's brain. Additionally, stories, as we all know, evoke emotion, which floods our brain with hormones. One notable is oxytocin, which is what prompts us to empathize with the people in the stories. Also, dopamine, which serves as a memory hook and helps to explain why it is that stories are so many more times memorable than facts and figures alone. So now that we've uncovered the power and the why of stories, let's get into the how by tapping into the expertise of two panelists that we have joining us today. First, I'd like to welcome Laura Nespoli. Laura, simply put, is passionate about strategic storytelling. That is her passion. And she has spent 15 years helping sales, marketing, brand, and products shape their stories through working with global brands as well as nonprofits. Currently, Laura is putting her expertise to use as a strategic director of the Article Group Agency. She is also the founder of the Meshin Movement, and this extraordinary organization is at the center of, it's a storytelling consultancy, and they're focused on strategy, social impact, and creative expression. Laura, it is an absolute pleasure having you with us today.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So happy to be here.
Also joining us is a friend and comrade, Karen Hurt. Karen is the CEO and founder of Let's Grow Leaders. It's a global leadership development firm which offers tools and practical tips for human-centered leadership. Karen, like Laura, is also a masterful storyteller, and I have been able to observe firsthand Karen's remarkable ability to strategically incorporate stories into keynotes and workshops to connect with her audience, keep them captivated, and inspire them to reach new heights. Welcome, Karen.
Absolutely my pleasure. This is going to be a great conversation.
It absolutely is. All right, so let's kick off with each of you describing, in your own words, in your own experience, what does it mean to be a strategic storyteller? And what are the elements to doing it really well, both as it relates to crafting the story and telling the story? Karen, why don't you kick us off?
You know, when you think about strategic storytelling, I like to describe it this way. It starts with your message. So the most important thing is you figure out, what do you want someone to think, feel, or do as a result of what you've got to say? And then you wrap your story around it. So it really begins with that level of intention. And, you know, one of the things you really can think about is knowing what your outcome is. Then you can mine your past. You can always be on the lookout for what are the stories that are going to resonate and really relate most closely to your audience. So that's where I would start. Now let Laura share, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of the details.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Karen. I'm building on that, like the intended outcome, that is strategy, right? Just trying to get to an advantageous change in thoughts, feelings, actions. Storytelling, to do that, I tend to break it down into 4 key elements. You have context. Where does this story begin? What is the backdrop for this story? And can we describe it in such a place that our audience would agree with us to start creating some empathy? And then what are the customer pain points, motivations? What are their drivers? So you've got context, customer. The third C I often think of as competitive. What are we up against? Is it other people we want to differentiate our story from? Are there other forces we're working against? And then the last one being our company, if we're talking about it in a brand sense. But it's the core of our intention. What are we providing? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to offer? And those 4 C's, I think, are basic building blocks for story that just allow you to scale the size of the story, the type of story, the outlet, the channel. It's universal in it, but it starts on those 4 blocks for me.
Yeah. I like the universal aspect, and you could easily substitute customer depending on your objective and your audience for your team. Yeah. It could be prospects. It could be a community that you're trying to influence to take action about a cause that's critically important to you. And I also loved, Laura, that you talked about in terms of the start, that critical point in terms of establishing that context and doing it in a way that's really going to resonate with your audience, and kind of getting to the importance of what Karen said in terms of really thinking through, what do you want your audience to know? What do you want them to do? How do you want them to feel? Which helps you to tailor the way you talk about that context and the whole story, for that matter.
Absolutely.
I think it's a lot about picking the right relatable story to your audience. You know, sometimes I will see like a senior executive get in front of 2,000 people at his company at an offsite and say, you know, let me tell you about a time that I was scuba diving in the Galapagos Islands. And you can just watch everybody go, great. Right? I went to Ocean City, Maryland for my vacation, right? You know, and so so that you immediately have the disconnect. So how can you create something that is, when people hear your story, they say, that reminds me of a time that this happened to me. And you were talking about the neuroscience, and that neuroscience really does say that too, that's why it helps that recall. Somebody tells a story, it pulls you into your own brain, it does recall, and now you've made that human to human connection. And on a related note, another mistake I see people make is they will try to be this hero of their own story. And, let me tell you about this time I did this wonderful thing. That immediately will pull people away from you. But if you can say, let me tell you how I learned this, and make somebody else the hero, then the humility of that immediately humanizes. Or if you talk about, hey, let me tell you about a time I really screwed up. Like 90% of my leadership training stories are things I did wrong. So learn from me. Don't screw up like this. Let me save you this pain and anxiety so that you can do something better.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, Karen. I would make the distinction from hero, but you can put yourself as the protagonist in a story.
Sure.
And oftentimes that protagonist does have a challenge that you're working against. So it is a little bit like the hero's journey, but it's not braggadocious. You actually want to put yourself in the protagonist of the story in such a way that your audience can feel what it was like to be in those shoes. And that's where you can actually start to create a connection and a connection over vulnerability, if that's the case, or something that they can actually see themselves in your story. And you can speak from that expertise without it feeling disconnected and distant.
Yes, exactly. The way we talk, we have our model that's called the stories model, and the O in the stories model is the other, right? So your protagonist is going around, and then they met the other, and this other person helped to create the pivot in that story. But you are a character in the story and telling your own story. But a lot of times when I'll teach executives how to tell a story that is going to help them communicate, I say, where did you learn what you learned? Like you weren't born learning it. So is there a story that somehow you learn from someone else? And not every story needs to be that way, but sometimes that can be helpful.
Yeah, just imagine the power of, let's say, a leader coming new into an organization, acquiring a team. That team maybe previously worked for another leader that they highly respected and, have some anxiety, skepticism about how this is going to work. If the leader kicked off by sharing a story of just this miraculous success, that's not going to do a lot to start to establish that connection, build that trust. However, if the leader talked about a significant failure in their career and how they learned about it, that willingness to show some vulnerability, that humility goes such a long way in starting to build that connection and forge those relationships. I love what Mark Brumley put here in terms of ensuring that your story relates to the audience. I remember a story in an all-hands meeting about a British ship captain. It didn't relate at all. Yeah, it may have been interesting, but not drawing your audience in. Yeah. So one of the things you both are emphasizing is, one, the power of structure, whether it's the 4 C's that you talked about, Laura, or another framework or structure that works particularly well for you. Having that framework is so essential to ensuring that, one, you keep the story tight and you don't ramble and veer off in directions, which causes you to lose the power of the story and your audience. It also is so informative for those where this maybe doesn't come naturally. Having that clear structure or outline to follow can be so incredibly helpful. You also talked about really thinking through the role of the character. If you're the lead character in that story, what's important to consider? What else? What other elements are so essential to being a strategic storyteller?
Well, you got me on structure. I definitely think, I often think about things like what's gonna help someone take action. I think functional, emotional. When it comes to storytelling, structure is the functional aspect of it. Emotional is empathy. And I think with those two things combined, I mean, this, just as we're talking about this leader, for instance, who comes into a new company, they're new, the whole team loved the former leader. So empathy with the fact that they don't know him. They had this really amazing connection with the person in the past. There's probably a lot of trepidation. There's maybe a little bit of fear. What's going to change? How is it going to affect me? Having that empathy in that situation would guide someone away from coming in and just like rah-rah selling, all the things that they've done and really connecting with where they are emotionally in that space. With empathy the and structure behind, you have so much opportunity to connect in various ways. And I think that's to apply that in a story business context. We often have a lot of people telling a story on behalf of a company, on behalf of a brand, telling a product story. If you have a unified structure, everyone's singing from the same song sheet, and everyone understands that story context and what their audience might be going through, you have a team of people that can tell that story from their unique angle, from their own words, but do so in such a way that there's synchronization, there's uniform success for the company, the brand, the product, whatever the case might be.
I love that. So if it's a brand or product story, there's got to be making it your own, but also making sure that you're honoring the overarching narrative and the main messages that you want to convey. Yeah. It looks like you want to add something, Karen.
I'm just thinking about, you said, like, what else? One of the things that I pay a lot of attention to is the opening of the story. Like, how quickly can you put people, get people on the same, in the same scene with you as fast as you can? And there's two ways that I like to do that. One is like tap and transport. So you say, has this ever happened to you? Like, so one of my signature stories is about a time that I really screwed up, is a story about authenticity. And so I set the stage by saying, have you ever thought you were leading extremely well and it turns out your team wasn't with you? So that's the tap. And then I say, I'd just been promoted to my very first executive role in human resources. It was concurrent with a merger at Verizon. All the players were new, right? And then I set it up. And then as it turns out, I was a single mom. So within 30 seconds, you've got the whole thing. I'm an executive. I've just gone through a divorce. I'm a single mom. And this is what's happening. And so I think one of the mistakes people make is they take way too long to set up that setting. But you can, if you work it, you can get it tight and say, what do they need to know? What is extraneous information that they don't need to know?
I really love that. Actually, one of the questions I was going to ask is, what's your advice for ensuring you don't put too much information in that context, which I often see people do. And and another question we get frequently is, what are my on-ramps? Like, how do I seamlessly kind of insert a story into the broader narrative or the broader presentation? And I love this concept of tap in transport. That's wonderful. So we have a question. Do you adjust your storytelling depending on whether you are presenting up to the C-suite versus presenting to your team?
Yes.
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 Are you never?
Absolutely. I mean, whatever the audience shift is, again, just the core elements of your story might be there, but how you express it, the way in, just as we're talking about, like, what is the tap and transfer? The way in might differ just on what's going to be relatable, what's going to create that one-to-one connection based on that audience's emotional needs, their functional needs. Where are they? And how do you connect with them? And you can still get to the same delivery of information you need to communicate, but the framing can shift depending on where they are.
And I think the formality of your story depends too. If you're sitting in an executive meeting and you're not going to say, "Now let me tell you a story," right? Your executive's going to wait. We don't have time for a story, but so you're more likely to say, "Oh, let me just share with you a quick example of how I know this can go sideways." Okay, it's like you're having the casual conversation. But if you are on a stage at a kickoff meeting for 2025 strategic planning, and you're telling a story to 2,000 people, well, you're more likely to, have act it out a bit and really engage the audience and bring it in. You could tell the same story in both of those contexts, but you would look ridiculous if you were, like I do. Well, and then my big band. Pickle play. I'm not going to do that in an executive meeting, but I will do that from a stage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was just looking at some of the comments that came in. Just one thing, and I think you touched on this, that I would add is a difference with speaking to the executives, it's just so essential that you lead with their bottom line, with your bottom line. I'm here to propose, here's how it's going to benefit the business. And then you may incorporate stories very, very strategically. Isabel brought up a great point. She said, I noticed that Karen used the present tense. I'm newly divorced, a single mother in a new role, makes the story much more immediate and compelling. Yes, that present tense is a key. And I want to acknowledge Beth. She responded to a prompt that we had at the outset in terms of what do you find most challenging. And she was asking about the risk of using humor.
Oh, so I'm sorry. Those are two very, very different things. Just to comment on the present tense, actually, I speak about story for strength, where I share a really core part of my life, my transformation story. And it always starts with, I grew up believing my feelings didn't matter. And it comes to a present tense, but I know that that is a very universal experience that we have as human beings. And so it is about me in the beginning, and it's talking about the past, but it is context for my story, and it is context that I think a lot of people relate to. So I don't know that you necessarily have to be in the present tense to make something relatable and connecting. The other question was
about humor.
And I have a point on this. I do a lot of work in marketing storytelling. And so we do some message testing or campaign testing to see what resonates with people. And there is one company, they actually test on the emotions that are most successful in eliciting a response from audiences. And humor is high on the list. So humor is actually a great way to connect with people emotionally. It doesn't, when we talk about emotions and storytelling, it doesn't always have to be this inspirational, sad music like the Procter & Gamble Moms campaign during the Olympics. It's a great ad and it's so emotional. But just as good is the Kmart Ship My Pants ad, because that is hilarious and that can drive great results. Surprise, Schadenfreude even are really other ways of connecting emotionally with people through story that do successfully change behaviors and mindset.
Well, yeah, I agree. And sometimes it is if you've built up a very serious story, a very emotionally connected story, a little bit of humor. So the story that I was just sharing with you is I usually do that as a cold open to a keynote, and it's an authenticity story, and it shows vulnerability, and I'm speaking about vulnerability, so it's example, but it's serious, and you're like, people are like, oh shoot, you really did screw that up, and then I have a line that's I say that is funny. And every time, and I did not know this because I was doing it started using it during the pandemic and everybody was on mute and I didn't know how funny it was. I thought it was funny, but everybody was on mute. So do a keynote, nobody laughs. First time I got up on the stage, I did it for about 2,000 people. 2,000 people just started cracking up. And I almost lost it because I was not expecting that response. But the reason it's funny, it's not that particularly funny, but it is funny because it's a release. And so that's a very well timed. You got to always keep that line in because people want to release before they can get to the learning, right?
Excellent. So timing is one of the keys. And always, 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 always knowing your audience and what's going to be appropriate and well-received humor versus something that may not be appropriate for the situation or the audience. Okay, I want to move on and talk about something you discuss in your bio, Laura. You talk about the expertise you have in helping people and organizations develop purpose stories. Can you elaborate on what you mean by a purpose story and talk a little bit about the process for developing one?
Sure. So a purpose story is a succinct articulation of a brand's reason for being in a single page. So it's a framework I use. At the top, it starts with a belief, a single-minded, profoundly human belief about the world. That is our context and customer connection point. So that is like the beginning of the story. And because of the existence of this issue, this pain, this problem in the world, therefore we exist to do this purpose. And is, how do we intend to affect the world, affect culture, affect our category for the better? And so belief, purpose, and then we stand up that purpose with commitments. And those commitments, I think, is really helpful to think about them as what we do, how we do it, and the impact that we want to have on our audiences, our customers, our partners. And so it's a very simple framework. As a marketer, I prefer that over some more traditional brand frameworks with vision statements, mission statements. Those are really complex. And when you want to have a whole company singing from the same song sheet and have people really connect and rally around and feel inspired by your story, I think a purpose story is great. I do the same work for solopreneurs and even professionals that work for companies, but they have trouble articulating their distinct magic that they bring to their job. And so I go through an exercise. The process to get there is an interview. And I have a handful of questions that I ask to uncover the belief statement, purpose questions, and then those commitments. And I call it a story immersion. And it's really, honestly, I always find that the story exists within people. I had one client who says, you can't really read the label from inside the jar. This was a company that helps other companies tell their purpose, but they couldn't get to their own articulation because they really struggled with hearing themselves. So the story immersion process itself, it's just listening, asking the right questions, probing for the right things that's deeper than just the surface level of what you're doing and delivering. It's really what's behind it. And that's what sets you apart is, you're creating that unique empathy with your audience.
Oh my gosh, so much in there, Laura. And I like how you can take that and help to define the brand in a unique way and take it to an individual. And at the beginning, you talked about making sure you get it to one page. I would imagine there's a lot of work involved in taking all of those insights and getting it concise to a single page.
Yeah. If there's a lot of stakeholders weighing in on a purpose, it can be a long process.
Yes. Yes. But so powerful in the end. Kieran, I know you do similar work with leaders. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we have a very simple, we call it the movie trailer exercise. We invite people to make a movie trailer about their own leadership. And so we just give them a couple of prompts. And this is something that if you are listening and you have a team of people, you can just go do with your team. It's super easy. So the prompts are in a world where, and that's where people describe the tension or problem that they exist to solve. So our in a world where for our company is in a world where many managers are feeling cynical, burned out, and disillusioned. So it's just really tight, right? One, you describe your heroic actor, and then will your heroic action. So our will is we'll stand up to cynical, dehumanizing leadership. Two, and what you do to share practical tools and techniques is ours, and help, and then who benefits from what you do. And so, in a world where many managers are feeling cynical, burned out, and disillusioned, one team of internationally known leadership experts will stand up to cynical, dehumanizing leadership to share practicals and to techniques and to help managers get results without losing their soul. And if you can just do that super fast, and we will do that in even in a keynote setting and just have people share it with a couple of people. And it's light because people get really creative with it. But it also really connects people to their deeper why they do what they do. And, the joy of the exercise is it takes 15 minutes. It really doesn't take a long time to create that human connection.
Wow. So once again, one of the through lines here is the power of that framework and those prompts along the way. We have Rick Gilbert weighing in, keep it short. Two great ones, Hemingway, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Trump, make America great again. Okay, love the movie trailer concept. So, Karen, I want to go back to something I mentioned during your intro, and that is how you strategically and very intentionally incorporate stories throughout keynotes or workshops. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about deciding what type of stories to include and how you think about where and when to incorporate them into the flow of the overall presentation or overall workshop.
Yeah, it's interesting when David and I design our programs, or even if we're designing a keynote, we will actually use colored index cards to say what kind of thing is happening here. Are we capturing attention and developing emotion and building, setting it up? That's where a good place is a story. Are we teaching a practical tool and technique, giving people the skills? And then are they interacting in practice? And so we're in a constant change of state between. So I won't tell a story that, we'll say, well, that was too long without a story, or that was too many stories as we're designing it. And so that's the first thing. You're wanting to constantly go for the change of state because people learn in different ways. Some people really dig the stories. Other people are like, no, I'd rather just get the practical things. So you're mixing it up for everybody, and you're mixing it up. Are they being talked, are you sharing information, or are they engaging with the information? And there's a lot of brain psychology about why all that stuff works too. So that's the first thing. And then the real, then the kinds of stories, what is your purpose? So we'll generally, if I'm doing a keynote, I open with a story that it takes, because you get introduced to these things, like, welcome, Karen Hurt, global data, Inga Baba. Well, that creates a distance, right? It sets some credibility, but it also creates a distance. So the very first thing I want to do on that stage is have them feeling, oh my goodness, she's just like me. Right. And because she's just like me, she gets me. And so that's why I tell a very vulnerable story at the beginning. So that's on purpose to do that. Because I'm confident enough that people understand why I have the right to be on this stage. Right. So you got to feel confident in that. But then you do. But then, the other kinds of stories is, what do you want? Learn from my mistake stories, or one kind of a story. Another story is, this is how you do story. So thinking about what you want is the kind of story. So for example, we tell a story about really creating clarity, and that you've got to set, real clear expectations. And the phrase that pays, Craig Valentine is he is a world champion of public speaking for Toastmasters. And I learned this from him. So I want to give him credit. But he calls it the phrase that pays. And so you tell your story, but then you land it with the phrase that pays. So I tell this story about, taking pictures of my Carrie, you've heard this story of my son in marching band. The whole point is, right, one good conversation about expectations prevents 14 why didn't you conversations. So if you can set it up with a story, you create an emotional thing. It's a short story, but then you tell them what to remember. And, people will walk away and they'll, see me at coffee and they'll say, one good conversation about expectations. You make it easy for them to remember your story with a shortcut.
Excellent. Wow. Phrase that pays. That's excellent. Karen, I had an add-on question. You talked about, and I just resonate with this so much. A keynote speaker, the introducer sharing your credentials, which of course is creating distance, and why it's so important that you lead with vulnerability so people can relate to you. And you have the confidence, you acknowledge you have the confidence to do that because of your experience, because of your credentials. What if you're newer to this and you're just starting? Maybe it's your very first keynote. What advice would you have?
First thing I would say, so the best advice I ever got in this came from my husband, who was also a keynote speaker. And it was the first time I had to speak to an audience that was more than 2,000 people, and it was in Asia. So and he just looks at me and he said, Karen, why do you do this? And then go change some lives. And he's like, talking to 50 people and talking to 2,000 people, it's the same thing. If you are there, not about you, you are there about them. But because the minute you make it about you, that's where all of that self-doubt is going to, am I good enough? What are they looking at? Do I look fat in this dress? Like, if you care about them, you don't care if you look fat in the dress, because it's not about you, it's about them. And so that's where I would say the first thing. And then the second thing is, there is a reason you are in that room, whether it's the first time you're presenting to executives, whether it's the first time you belong in that, somebody put you in that room. So own your strengths and take confidence in that. And Carrie, I know you talk a lot about this in your power speaking, which is, and then don't undermine what you're about to say by telling people not to listen to you. Like, don't say, I'm not the, notice I do not tell them I'm not the most qualified person in the room. I tell them that I am an expert in authenticity because I learned it the hard way. So that is a difference. I'm not saying I'm not an expert in authenticity. I'm saying I am because of I learned these things, and so I think that's part of it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. And we talk about that a lot as well, is come with a service-oriented mindset. I'm here to serve the needs of the audience, to make a genuine connection and hopefully provide something of value, shifting that focus from yourself and this concern about making sure you're perfect to serving the audience can do a lot in terms of bringing down that anxiety. Laura, I have a question for you, but was there anything you wanted to build onto that?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's go back to one of your many areas of expertise, and that's helping to use story to build brands, to promote products. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see companies make in trying to develop that product story?
It's what a perfect tie-in. This is the build on what Karen was just talking about. It's really the biggest mistake is making it about the product. They have, the value proposition that they want to communicate. They have all the proof points. They have the details about the product. And I think this is especially hard when you've got sellers and product development folks or founders who are trying to get their story out there, and they need to convince the world of how critical the product is and what it can do. They need to convince investors. So they're really focused on how this product is different from what's come before. And I think that they forget that they have to do that in such a way that it's going to be meaningful and resonant with the audience. So it goes back to those 4 C's and the anchoring point. And again, that C for customer doesn't always have to be a customer. It could be an audience. It could be someone else. But that human being on the other side of this story, who is that for? Because ultimately, the best storytelling in brand and product marketing is about connecting human insight, a human-centered empathy or insight with the product. Of course, with market knowledge and all that, all the layers that go with it. But if you're just myopically focused on what you're setting out to do, you'll miss the point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of themes throughout that apply regardless of who your audience is, the objective that you're trying to achieve. Many universal things. I think we have a question. This comes from Rachel. Practical advice for presenters in the workplace, especially technical folks. So I'm going to make some assumptions here. And we work at PowerSpeaking with a lot of very, very brilliant, highly technical people for which this skill does not come naturally. It's a big stretch. So what advice do you have to make this more accessible, how to get started, how to get comfortable, honoring your unique style to telling a powerful story that's going to evoke emotion and action?
The most important thing I would say, if you're highly technical, and I work with a lot of highly technical people too, is you use simple language. Explain it as if you tell your story as if you were telling your best friend on a walk, as opposed to, will your audience understand the words that you're using, the technical jargon? Sometimes technical people they're very smart and they have a lot of big words. And, so how do you just make it so that anybody can understand what you're saying, and you will not look any dumber? Like, I think people worry, like, I won't look smart if I have a wonderful, wonderful human-centered leader that I work with in one of my clients, and he's a medical expert. He is incredible. And the reason he is so successful is when he gets to these medical conferences, he explains it in a way that any person can understand it. And then he makes those audience members feel like they are smart, as opposed to thinking that he is smart, even though he's one of the smartest people I know.
Yeah, I agree. We often say, the work that we do in product marketing, we're simplifying complex marketing challenges. We're mostly talking to B2B tech buying audiences. They live in technicalities. But the reality is their decision-making and what they have to navigate in their day-to-day is so complex. They need someone who's going to communicate the details for them to make decisions, or to, even if this is internal, in simple terms. And I would say also, the way that we're using story in this conversation, sometimes we're talking about sharing a personal story as if it was a direct experience, an anecdotal story. But there's also just creating a presentation that carries an audience through a story arc. And it doesn't have to be an obvious story in the traditional sense. It is just starting with context. Why are we here having this conversation? Like, what is the reality that we can all agree on? And that becomes an immediate connecting point for your technical audience to be like, okay, she gets it, he gets it. And then connecting with them, I know that this causes these pain points for you. I know that you're experiencing these challenges. Again, connecting with them. So through just presenting information in context, pain points, consequences of those pain points. What are you feeling in a deeper way that maybe aren't the surface pain points, but show you that I understand at a deeper level. And there's a deeper connection there, even if it's latent needs you might not even realize, bringing those forward. And then that kind of brings you to this point, all right, let's talk about how we're going to solve this. And then you can present your solution, whether it's a new process or whether it's integrating a new product into things, or how we're going to make a shift and maybe people aren't going to like it. But we've now carried them through this point where they understand why we're doing it. And we're acknowledging what they might feel and how tough it might be for them. So I think, really using that structure of like a core narrative and the arc with it will get you to that point where you take the consequence of all this tension and pain point and frustration, and you present a solution that now makes sense contextually, and you can deliver the proof points underneath it for that following action. And I think that's really helpful to consider with technical audit. And it goes back to that question, Carrie, that you asked earlier about common mistakes people make. You might think, I have a technical audience here. Let me get right into the details and what we're going to talk about. But that's not necessarily the way in.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that I would add, because it is a question that we regularly get from highly technical people who are often in a position in which they're speaking to a very, very mixed audience who may not have a lot of familiarity with the topic at all, to those that are highly technical and are there to really get into very technical, deep detail. And our advice is to be very transparent at the outset. Here's what we're trying to achieve. I recognize that we have a variety of needs and familiarity in the room. So we're going to start general to make sure we're all on the same playing field. And then if you use, for instance, a metaphor to connect that complex topic to something that's relatable, it really helps those that don't have that level of deep expertise. And it also decreases the likelihood that those highly technical people are going to be put off by, seriously, you really need to use that metaphor to help me connect with this. They'll be more understanding and forgiving. And then near the end, you get to that detail and you can even excuse, here's where we're going to really get into the weeds. So those of you that were coming, etc. It's okay. Be transparent. That's serving the needs of the audience.
I love that. And I do something similar for when I've got an audience of people that are like, okay, you're going to be speaking at our offsite. And we've got everybody from the CEO all the way through the organization to the frontline people who are answering the phone. Make your keynote relevant to all of those folks. And I want you to talk about courage, right? So what I'll do is I'll go to one side of the stage and I say, so if you are a people leader and you really want people to be courageously sharing their ideas, this isn't a great approach. And then I walk to the other side of the stage and I say, and if you are thinking, how do I have the courage to speak up and share my ideas? Think about it this way. And you've acknowledged the room and quickly gone both sides. And that way everybody feels like you're speaking to them.
Love it. Love it. This takes a lot of skill and practice. I want to acknowledge that as well. And I can personally say I've gotten it right. And there's some times where it's been a complete failure, but it doesn't cause me to stop. I learn from it and move on. So be willing to take that risk and practice. Let's go to two other key points that I'd love to touch on. One relates to using story in a community to try to influence people to take action with regard to a cause that's maybe very, very important to you. It might be climate change. It might be about the homeless. It might be about education, social justice, you name it. There are a whole lot of causes out there. What advice do you have for using story to try to influence action as effectively as you possibly can?
Laura, I think that went for you.
Okay, I'll take it. I think, so this is very near and dear to me. I talk about marketing for more movement and social impact, and I see just a lot of missed opportunities because I think causes with all their heart and all their passion and all their good intentions forget that if an audience isn't listening to them now, they're not passionate about it. And oftentimes it is the most extreme causes, the really polarizing things that we need to find people. We need to bring people to center. We need to open eyes for people that are willing to draw the shade down and not look at something, whether it's because it's too painful to see and it's just too hard. And that is a human reaction. And so I think hitting them with the facts in that instance, or hitting them with the impact of the injustice, is often too much. And I think the biggest mistake causes make is not thinking through, I've talked about the 4 C's a lot, but when we dig into that customer or audience angle, it is motivations, and a big part of it is barriers. What barriers do we have to overcome in getting them to change their mind, to change their behaviors, to feel differently? And those barriers are going to be very different from your passionate activist and what they see as the biggest motivators and drivers. I'm an idealist, so I have lived my life with like a mindset of like, if they could just see, but they can't and they don't want to. So you have to really think like, what am I up against and how do I really zero in on those barriers? And it might have nothing to do with what would motivate or drive you. Climate change, for instance. Do you have to think about what's in it for them? Where is it money motivated? Maybe it's investing in green funds. There's so many different ways, but I think what barriers you have to overcome is often like a turning point that I think we could zero in on better and start to like lift the shade a little bit.
Excellent. Karen, what would you add?
I also think I love everything she said, first of all. And then I also think there's a way to get people to tap into their own stories and their experiences with whatever that is, that social change that you're making. I have a friend named Sherry Gegelman who a couple of years ago was bringing together women to tell these stories of women in Saudi Arabia and all these different countries who had all these different challenges. And the way and they had very diverse perspectives, very different political experiences and belief systems and values. And she was her whole thing was to create community and inclusion. And she had a very deliberate way of getting people to tell the stories. And at the end of everyone telling their stories, people were like, oh, we're not that different. Right. And so we created some common ground, and then they got to talk about some of the bigger issues that they needed to collaborate on. But first they had to get to the point that we're more similar than we might think.
Common ground is key. I love that.
Yes. And in a previous conversation that we had, Karen, you brought up the really essential point that The story alone isn't enough. You have to provide
action.
some very, very small, accessible actions. So how do I get started? Something that's doable and within reach for whatever audience.
So your next step, so one step you can take is a great, so that you got the emotional attachment through the story, and then here's one simple thing you can do next.
Yeah. And that just builds from there. One action demonstrates commitment that keeps them cycling through action, reinforces new belief, new thoughts, new feelings, reinforces the action and builds.
Yes. All right. I'd love, with the time we have remaining, to bring this to a more personal level. We haven't talked a lot about the fact that stories can be very healing, a source of resilience. Laura, would you share a little bit more about how stories can be used in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually what got me talking about story for strength and resilience, was my own personal transformation story, my own experience going through this after a long time working in brand storytelling and marketing storytelling. I went through a really significant hurdle in my life and some pretty significant challenges. First of all, what actually had me realize that story was such a critical tool, I was getting trained as a coach for a nonprofit youth organization, and they had an exercise to help me understand how to see the girls on my team, the context they would bring to the group, these preteens. They had a little poem that had blanks in it, like a Mad Libs. And it was like the neighborhood, smells from your neighborhood, sounds from your home, favorite holiday memories. And once I filled it in and saw my own story, I was just taken back. And it was as if stepping outside myself and seeing my story for the first time. And all of a sudden, I saw my whole history in new light. I was brought to tears, and it triggered a confrontation of childhood trauma I had never really dug into before. I had pulled the blinds down. I didn't want to see it. And I think so, story at that point, I started sharing more of my story. And the more I told my story, the stronger I felt in who I was becoming. I had to kind of hit a rock bottom and share that. And then I started speaking about that. And what I realized is just what you started with at the beginning, Carrie, where you're talking about neurocoupling and all that we've talked about creating empathy with an audience. When you tell your own story as if it's a story, even if you're just, to yourself, even if you're documenting it for yourself, seeing yourself as a protagonist gives you this ability to step outside your own negative self-talk, the daily sort of inner monologue that we experience, putting it in like a third-person view of things, for me, actually had me see myself in a different light. And it was so transformational. I started speaking about my story. A company asked me to start speaking about story and dug into this more and more. And I ultimately wrote a memoir that I'm not going to publish as a memoir, but just that process of getting it all out allowed me to see my story through time. And even in the year or so since I finished that process, I still see new angles. The story itself gives me new light. I'm able to embrace the experience and get new learnings from it all the time. So I think exactly what we talked about, the way that you connect with an audience, you can connect with yourself in a different way by framing your story for yourself. It's incredibly healing.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
It's obviously deeply, deeply personal. And I'm certain I personally resonate. One of the things I was thinking about is you're kind of helping me to see why the power of journaling is so incredibly important, and shaping that into a story that you're willing to really accept and understand and move on. Just the other thing that I'd add is not only can it be instrumental in serving as a source of strength and resilience, the willingness to be vulnerable and share that story with others, how incredibly healing that can be for others to get to that same place. Mental illness is something very important to me. And I just love the fact that so many people, more and more people, are willing to come out and talk about it, share their own experience. And
yeah, I honestly, like, if I don't want to use up too much, I know we're kind of winding down on time, but when I say all this, I don't want to make anyone that we're talking to and anyone that's here with us today to think that it's easy. I mean, the first time I shared my story, I was bawling, and I was sharing my story out to the board of directors of this nonprofit that had helped me come to this realization so I could do a fundraiser for them. And I was hysterically crying and saying to my husband, like, they're going to think I'm so weird, but I couldn't not share it. And so it isn't comfortable, but I thought they would think I was weird, and yet the messages I got in return were just like, thank you so much. And then other people opened up and shared their story back, because we are all human, and the stories that connect us to one another are so much closer than we know they are. We just don't talk about it as much as we could to actually benefit from each other's stories for our own healing.
That is a powerful, inspirational way to end. And I want to thank you both so very much for sharing your wisdom. We could go on for hours and hours. Tap into these incredible resources. I also want to remind everybody joining us that we do have an entire workshop on this topic. So that if this is a skill, it's a superpower that you want to invest in getting better at, I encourage you to check that out. Thank you again, Laura. Thank you, Karen. And we will close by giving you a peek into the topic that we're going to be discussing next month. And thank you also to our audience.
Thanks.
Next month, we're going to be talking about the power of visuals, visual aids that elevate your talk, your story, your presentation.